Chapter 14, Pathology, Neuroses. I can picture David screwing his face up and telling me that the term neurosis is old-fashioned, and you probably agree. Both you and David are correct, it is old-fashioned. But very often, as in this case, old-fashioned is good. Let me explain why. Psychosis and neurosis are both illnesses. Why do I say this? Because, before and after the illness, you behave differently and resort to being either what you were before or move to a new steady state of behavior. The psychotic often does not return back to his previous behavior, but to a new steady state. The new state includes his so-called defective states. To make things even more confusing for you, generally speaking, every neurosis is superimposed on a personality disorder. Similarly, for every personality disorder there is a corresponding neurosis. So, what is the difference between, say, a neurotic personality disorder and a neurotic disorder? The answer is that the personality is better than a diamond, it really is forever. The neurosis is a disorder with the beginning and an end and is alien to the sufferer. They may say, I wasn't like this. I don't know what has changed or why. Change is always good for others, but never for you. The personality disorder patient always feels that what he is doing, thinking or feeling is the way to go, at least for him. It feels comfortable to him and on him. It is the me that I know and used to be. As we will see later, any changes are difficult and uncomfortable. To give an insight, we always prefer what we know, even if it is a bad what we know. With personality disturbances, there is a distortion of reality testing. It is as if there is a qualitative change. The person thinks and arranges his thoughts differently from everyone else. A characteristic of neurosis is a heightened level of anxiety. Of course, certain personality disorders and certain behavior disorders will have an increased concomitant level of anxiety. But, the level of anxiety is nowhere as high. There are many kinds of neuroses. I will mention just a few. OCD is, in all probability, the most difficult neurosis to treat. I want to make one point very clear, not all that is considered to be OCD is really OCD. Let me explain. OC stands for obsessive-compulsive. This means that the patient has an overwhelming desire to repeat an action or think a thought. We all know the feeling and action when we go back and check, turning the lights off in our car or testing the doorknob one more time to make sure we have really locked the door. This is obsessive behavior. It might be indicative of a personality and it might be indicative of obsessive behavior, per se. Don't worry, this will all become clear to you. For this to be a neurosis, two things have to occur. Firstly, the behavior undoes a feeling of tension that would increase if the action or thought was not undertaken. Secondly, and far more importantly, the behavior should be seen as being strange and serving no purpose other than to release anxiety, as we mentioned above. If we believe that it is quite natural to check the door 3 times before leaving the house, and there's nothing unnatural about it, then we are not talking about OCD. Secondly, and far too often overlooked, the behavior must be deemed by the person as being completely superfluous and having no meaning in itself. They almost sound the same, but they are not. Let me explain. In the first case, we may have been brought up to test the door 3 times and it seems a natural, normal thing to do. It is something that we do. But, if we do not tread on a certain line at a certain time, because we are convinced that we will be struck down by lightning from the evil God who has taken over the world, we are not suffering from OCD, we are plainly psychotic. The repeated action must be an unwarranted drive, not a repeating desire fueled by a psychotic premise. Obsessive-compulsive phenomena are just that. They are indicative of one of 3 things, and they have no right to be an entity in their own without evaluating what is happening. If you remember, we talked about the need to take the out of uncertainty. We are trying to predict, and at worst, we are 50% accurate. The OCD patient seems to do 3 things. He has a lower tolerance to uncertainty and anxiety. He uses the same act he did with his magic blanket or teddy bear, and he cannot learn that the act has failed. He is not storing the experience in a productive way. He is caught in a positive feedback loop. You remember what that is? I chose OCD as a neurosis because it is a particularly difficult phenomenon to deal with and to explain. I do know that Freud had a great deal of difficulty in explaining OCD in psychodynamic terms. Not that I'm comparing myself with Freud, but nonetheless, the entity is extremely bizarre. I find it difficult to explain how repetition has any evolutionary benefits. I will mention repetition and rote when I mention learning phenomena. We seem to store different things we commit to memory in the automatic everything. The automatic thinking is in charge of how we think prospectively. Do you remember the survival of the fittest bud-like thought giving an answer to what to do in response to the events going on around us? If you recall, and I hope you do, automatic thoughts are colored by our automatic feelings. Similarly to automatic feelings, we have automatic behavior. When we evaluate a situation in the automatic everything and the event is not brought into awareness, it may be suitable to react using automatic behavior. I postulate that rote is a shorthanded way of storing without experiencing and dreaming in our automatic everything. I think we may explain short-term and longer-term memory. As you will see later in our discussion of PTSD, at some point, we do not wish to overload our automatic everything. If the information leading to a particular behavior is not used, it will be discarded. You will see the immense importance of this when we are trying to change behavior, in other words, therapy. It may well be that OCD as a neurosis is in fact a breakdown of this process. It is as if the information or action is about to be lost and is thus reinforced when there is no need to do so. The explanation is weak because it begs another question. Where is the anxiety coming from? Why is the sufferer of OCD unable to give an explanation to why he is doing what he is doing? Again, this is applicable when we are talking about the true OCD. As I said, OCD is extremely difficult to treat, as it is extremely difficult to explain. The only good thing about OCD is that in the passage of time, like schizophrenia, it too seems to reach a plateau, level off and indeed get less severe. But there can be no mistake. It is a severely incapacitating illness. I have never seen any illness which places the family and immediate support group under corrosive strain as much as OCD does. Again, I have no explanation as to why. Let's deal with phobias. I often wonder why there are so many names for different phobias. It is as if the specialists in the field are extremely obsessive. Agoraphobia, claustrophobia and all the many phobias are similar, in as much as being in certain positions elicit anxiety. All phobias have a similar quality about them at the feeling of panic, which is not similar to the anxiety we described when talking about the child wandering away from his mother and fearing doing something wrong. The anxiety is different from the child who is terrified that the world is about to end and he doesn't know why. Neurotic anxiety is not similar to the anxiety felt by the psychotic. The psychotic anxiety of cataclysmic indescribable doom is that of the undefined infant in its cot. The neurotic anxiety is that of the exploring child wondering what he will discover, and what is the cost. Will there be a reward or a rollicking? The consistency of the parents' reactions are of paramount importance. There is fear and there is guilt, but the neurotic can describe his anxiety. They may not know why they feel this way, but they can qualify the anxiety. A psychotic cannot. In the neuroses, there is no equivalent deterioration of the cognitive aspects as are seen in the psychosis. Judgment and reality testing remain intact. What we are seeing here is like a solar flash of primordial anxiety which reaches the surface of the ego without any other damage. In some respects, it too becomes an almost learnt phenomena. It is as if they have learned something which is completely inappropriate, but nevertheless, becomes an established part of their repertoire. In some respects, neuroses seem to be a defect, whereby we are unable to contain the anxiety, whilst learning that we are separate from the parent and take the action of going out into the world. If you remember, the child feels that at any moment he is about to do something wrong, even though he is acquiring new information. So again, we see three phases. The anxiety increases to an intolerable level, the child explains the anxiety wrongly, and finally the child enters into a positive feedback loop where the anxiety increases instead of decreasing. Thus, the child is not able to allow this completely erroneous behavior to go fallow. I wish to mention two other neuroses. The first is the hysterical neurosis. Do you remember I mentioned fiction when discussing the psychotic? Here, the psychotic produces new experiences that never were, but they are a new reality. The hysterical neurotic distorts or ignores experiences that were. The hysterical neurosis was more common at the time of Freud, and we are very rarely seeing now. This patient behaves as if something obvious to everyone else is missing. Conversely, they may act as if something that is missing is very much alive. Let me give you two examples, hysterical blindness and what we call Belle indifference. In the case of hysterical blindness, there can be no doubt whatsoever that the patient does not see. The patient has no ability to recognize what everybody else is seeing. It is as if his eyes have ceased to function. In this case, we have a different explanation. When the reality is so awesome, the selection of the most suitable or fittest thought is not really part of reality. It is as if the body is adopting unto itself the solution that it really would like to see, but isn't there. As you see, this is a different kind of neurosis. It is a fabulous way of negating anxiety. No matter how bad things are, the patient is gloriously indifferent. I will give examples of this when discussing therapy. But, to whet your appetite, let me tell you about Belle indifference and hysterical blindness. M. was a lieutenant. He was in a smiling and congruent mood. Smiling can be incongruous in many a situation, but to do so in the middle of a war when you are freshly blinded, takes some beating. The grinning lieutenant could not tell us much about himself. He could remember his name but not that of his accompanying wife. She was horrified, but relieved to hear that his condition was purely emotional. We soon understood M's story, and when he did too, he saw everything very clearly. 2 years previously M's was a fledgling tank commander. There is nothing so dangerous as an enthusiastic idiotic action, as we are about to find out. In a platoon of 2 tanks, M. foolishly outflanked his platoon commander and raced into an open space. He immediately drew anti-tank fire. The fire hit his platoon commander's tank. The platoon commander was killed, and the tank driver was, as you can almost guess, the driver was blinded. M. managed to get the distraught driver into his tank and withdraw. M's efforts were rewarded by the driver's cursing, resounding recrimination that M had killed the platoon commander. Under deep hypnotherapy, M. told us, "I thought about putting a bullet in his brain. After all, what life was waiting for this blind man?" The incident passed. 2 years later, the Yom Kippur War broke out. M. was enlisted. As his tank was driving toward the front on the Golan, they saw our casualties streaming down the mountain. One had copious bandages swathed around his head covering both the injured soldier's eyes. M. stopped the tank. He got out and sank to his knees, telling his startled and mystified tank driver, "Tell my wife I am so sorry." They managed to stop M shooting himself in the brain. We must return to our explanation. How do we fit this behavior into our model? We pictured experiences, recalled previous experiences, fit in new experiences and possibilities, and we are able to store everything in the subconscious aware and unaware part of our conscious. It is as if at some point, what we wish to be true can become true. Is this so bizarre? Not really. We do know that false memories can be planted into a patient's experiences. Okay, you would say, that doesn't really explain what is happening here. Let me give you another example of an everyday occurrence where what we wish to happen does happen. It's called placebo. We do know that at least 30%, if not more, of any medical action is placebo. Why discuss this in terms of psychiatry? Let's use it in an even more profound way. It was reported that people who chose an operation to have their stomach shortened and lose weight were put into 2 groups. Those who underwent the operation and those who had their abdomen opened and then closed. Neither group was told what they had undergone. Both groups thought they had had a shortened stomach. This fact was hidden from the non-operated group. Even in the non-operated group there were substantial weight losses. The explanation probably would be best given by the Eastern therapies and beliefs. There is one kind of behavior which may rarely occur as a neurosis. That is altruism. I'm not going to go fully into altruism, but I do believe that it too can present itself as a kind of neurosis, inasmuch as if it is prevented, the person becomes deeply anxious. I also feel that one's representation of one's needs should have some importance in our behavior. I know evolutionary-wise, altruism is a wonderful thing. Suffice it to say, as healthy as it may sound to continually forego oneself to avoid anxiety, in many respects, it is neurotic. As you will discover later, I have never met an altruistic personality. Yes, I have met altruistic behavior in quite normal people. You may have noticed that I have not mentioned neurotic depression. I think that non-psychotic depression can best be described when we discuss personality disorders. I feel that non-psychotic depression is merely something that most dysmorphic personalities will undergo very often in their lives. It is important to note once again, there is no such thing as a paranoid neurosis. Many of us blandly designate hysterical behavior as being paranoid. There is a vital difference. The paranoid distorts reality, but his judgment with regard to how people will react is quite good. The paranoid knows that once he tells you, he will be considered a lunatic. The hysteric's reality testing is fine. But the judgment is distorted. They behave oddly. Paranoids go from being paranoid personalities to psychotics with nothing in between. I am going to deal with PTSD as a neurosis, although I do this grudgingly. PTSD is not a psychosis, but like OCD in its severe form, it can be severely incapacitating. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, has become quite a buzzword, and in many cases, the flavor of the month diagnosis. As a veteran military psychiatrist, I have seen far too many soldiers suffer from this illness. In my day, PTSD was defined after a life-threatening event. I prefer that description. In my experience, one of the basics of PTSD I am familiar with is the fear of death. I saw the angel of death, when reported, is a pathognomonic sign of PTSD. It is as if the patient has glimpsed beyond the normal life experiences and looked the angel of death in the eye. It is as if the traumatic experience cannot be ingested in the library of life's experiences. Our experiences are catalogued as part of the stream of life's events. Nightly, our experiences are sent back and exist permanently in our subconscious. The traumatic memory barely passes by the curtain between the aware and non-aware. It never seems to get to the dream stage and becomes integrated as a memory and an emotion. PTSD, like the psychosis, causes secondary damage. It seems to derail the ability to propose alternatives. As you remember, we select the best possible thought. In PTSD, this process is negated, and the thoughts hover around the theme of the trauma all the time. We are artificially designating psychoses and neuroses by the ability to test reality. In the case of PTSD, it is neurotic, inasmuch as reality testing is quite normal and yet, the results are similar in destruction to the psychosis. From the trauma onward, the ability to draw from experience is severely curtailed. If we imagine the psychosis as an electrical fire, then let's find a similar, yet different model for PTSD. Imagine a huge railroad network with many branches and side branches. The lines go to and from the large depot to the many termini. One line has a train crash and most of the branches stop working. Everything is concentrated through one route and the rest are inactive. The remaining route is overburdened and often misfunctions. Ephraim's story. Ephraim's story is a harrowing one. He was one of our first patients in the horrible Yom Kippur War. Adi, another soldier, would explain to Ephraim and the other patients what was expected and what we were trying to do in terms they would understand. We found it easier for soldiers to talk to soldiers. The stigma seemed to be much easier for them to bear. Ephraim's job as an orderly was to tend the soldiers who were arriving at the first aid centers directly behind the lines. Ephraim broke down when he started asking everybody if he, the soldier, had seen Ephraim's son. Ephraim became convinced that his son was dead. He stopped functioning completely. I will go into his therapy when we discuss therapy of PTSD. To emphasize, a tragedy of war and maybe contradict some of the notions held about Israel, let me tell you about another father. He was an elderly Bedouin scout. He was very depressed and anxious, and too, had stopped functioning. His son, like his father, was a scout. Unfortunately, the son was missing in action while facing the Egyptian army. It was known that the Egyptian army had overrun the area where the boy was serving. I never will forget the day they came to tell him that they had found his son dead. The man cried with relief, as did everybody around him. It had been a question if he had been taken into captivity and tortured by the Egyptians or if he had died in the battle. The father was relieved that his son was spared the ignominy of torture. It was achingly sad as we sat around to both commiserate with him and congratulate him that the boy had died easily. War is terrible. A survivor's story. When the war was over, I had gained a reputation for treating PTSD. I was serving as a psychiatrist in a military prison. The commander of the unit asked me to talk to one of the orderlies. He was convinced that he had PTSD. When the guy walked into my room, I didn't need to be told he had PTSD. There is no way you can mistake the look of the PTSD soldier. He has the distant gaze of a man who has looked into the valley of death. Back then, there was heroism which nobody could match. I remember one soldier being interviewed on television and asked why his unit had charged the Golan Heights. The stony-eyed boy answered very simply, "The Golan is the eyes of the country." Whilst this being very true, the mental and physical cost was overwhelming. The orderly sat down. "Doctor, you think you know what PTSD is? Let me tell you, you don't. I'll tell you what PTSD is. I was serving on the Sinai front. I became a true fighter and warrior, and I could recognize when a shell was fired and where it was likely to land. One day, I heard the exit of a shell, I heard the whistling, and I knew that shell was on me. There was an explosion and sand and dust all over the place. I knew I was dead because the quiet was that of the graveyard, and yet, so reassuring. If I was dead, I was not suffering anymore. I felt myself and discovered that my body was whole. If I was dead, I had no more bodily needs. I could treat my soldiers without fear. I didn't need to eat or even smoke. I could treat them and give them my food, my water, and my cigarettes. Then, I heard another shell, and I knew it was on me again. But this time I had no need to worry because I was already dead. I heard the explosion and I saw a soldier disintegrate in front of me, and part of his body flew over my head. The orderly stopped. He looked into my eyes. "Doctor, I failed. My failure, my inability to put that soldier back together again, that is PTSD." With that, he left me. I was astounded. It was not the first time I had heard the story about the inability to save other people's lives being the cause of the PTSD. It was as if at that time reality testing had become warped. I remembered boys who had heroically tried to save people, and when they hadn't, they collected the body parts and tried to piece them together or asked somebody else to. I remember the soldier who was so conflicted about saving his parents from the new Nazis who would be coming to destroy them or to undo the parents' victory over the Nazis, himself, and getting killed. In this case, he decided he was already dead. The end of story is extremely harrowing. Having undergone severe PTSD and being withdrawn from the lines from that day on, every time he shaved, he no longer saw his face. He saw a skull. After he fulfilled his biological promise to defeat the Nazis by coming back and having a child, he committed suicide. There is no glory in war. There is only profound misery. We are now going to mention another aspect of neurotic behavior. When we were discussing cognition, I said that, ideally, we should be overcoming everything that is bothering us and simply enjoy ourselves. This sounds alien. In fact, it is the antithesis of the Judeo-Christian work ethic. People who live according to the pleasure principle are often looked upon as being psychopaths. In some respects, psychopaths do obey the pleasure principle. But, because psychopaths have given the pleasure principle a bad name, it does not mean that pleasure principles should be thrown out. Far too often, a patient comes to me to overcome something from which they suffer. They seem to think that the end of suffering means he is well. It most certainly does not. It means that he is simply not suffering, and this is all he is looking for in life. When this is all you are looking for, you will certainly suffer at some time, and quite often. Life is not about suffering and not suffering. It is about enjoying. How did this come about? When did we forego happiness? How does it happen? As the child develops, it undergoes experiences which limit the child and which are essential in development as part of learning. If there was no anxiety, the child would never learn not to stick his fingers in the electricity socket. When we have learned not to stick our fingers into electricity socket and we can go past the socket to play with the nice teddy bear, we are happy. Even when we learn not to put our fingers in the socket, and our mother is terrified or frightened that we still might, then we do not get the same result. If she is not consistent, we will get a different result. The background anxiety never goes away. At some point, we learn very quickly that we must allay mother's anxieties, and we take this with us. We are trying to allay what others might think or feel. Now, this is in direct negation to what I have been saying before about learning to live within the norms and structures of the family, society, and so on. Well-being for so many is not learning how to enjoy yourself. It is more than this. It is learning how to be anxiety-free when living within the constraints and boundaries of frameworks which we have declared ourselves to belong. In other words, we can see ourselves as being part of a system, part of a belief system which we have taken upon ourselves to accept either fully or partially because of what we belong to. Don't be concerned. This may sound very obtuse and very complicated. In many respects it is, but it will become much clearer as you delve into the role of therapy. We are living as a balance between us and them. It is not an either/or. It is very much a summation of being able to keep a sense of identity and awareness at all levels of where we are and where we belong. We must have an appreciation of what is going on, what it means to you as a person and a member, what you really want and how you are really going to achieve what you want. If you give up on yourself, you will never have full satisfaction and joy, and compromise by telling yourself that not suffering is enough. It isn't, and you can be sure that you pay the price, because as you fluctuate from not being anxious or sad, at some point, you will be sad. Working with the principle of this is what I want, and understanding that I may not always be able to get it, understand why and achieve a compromise. You will fluctuate between happiness and unhappiness. The choice is yours to make which dyad will control your life: happy, not happy, or suffering, not suffering. To do this, very often we have to completely recalibrate the automatic everything. In other words, what I'm saying is that as opposed to the Freudian analysis where we go into the subconscious, I firmly believe that in modern therapy we are going into the non-awareness and recalibrating that. At some point, we must re-establish our ability to fantasize and to ask, why not? As a summary, I would say that neuroses do exist. They are there as we find what is difficult to cope with and the anxiety that we should learn to cope with as we are setting out to discover the world. This is not the same kind of anxiety we feel when we are first discovering ourselves. In other words, when we were separated and individuated. The anxiety and the neuroses seem to be part of the acquiring information and storing it in the automatic everything. It seems to be part of the process where we are unable to store and discard. Neuroses can often be as debilitating as psychoses. Unfortunately, we behave as if the circumstances we experienced when we were 5 have become the background radiation of our environment. In other words, nothing has changed, so we should behave the same way. In many respects, we see the neurotic behavior as part of the family pathology, where the soon-to-be neurotic has learnt the behavior in a disturbed background. In the disturbed background, he copes very well. Unfortunately, he seems to be very disturbed when he is in a normal background. As we have noticed, the family environment should allow the child to develop, go forth in the world and overcome not only his anxieties, but to seek happiness. I should imagine that David would impatiently add that 2 children growing up in the same environment behave differently, and some people behave very strangely no matter to what they are reacting. That is why we